Hello, welcome to Dive into World Building. Here we are, still doing this thing. Yay. And today we're talking about information management. And this is, I know, a weird topic, but what I mean by information management is not how people and cultures manage information. What I mean is how authors manage the world building information that they put into their stories. So this includes the question of info dumping, but it is not exclusively the question of info dumping. So does that make sense?
Clear as mud, but we will make it happen.
Well, okay. So there are a couple things that I'm thinking of, right? One is, how quickly can you bring a person into a world without making them confused in a way that you do not intend? Obviously, confusing people is a technique, and that sometimes works. But how can you bring somebody into your world without completely overloading them unnecessarily? And also, I think there's a question related to sort of story arcs. How do you keep new information from cluttering up climactic moments, right? If there's information that you need in order to make the climax work, where should you put it? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So
yeah, especially if you're like have a mystery or a revelation in the plot, you want generally the reader to have a shot at picking up the pieces and connecting the dots before it actually comes out on the page.
Yes.
And, like I was reading a book that's coming out in October, and there was a revelation about one of the characters, and about 2 pages before the revelation I was like, wait, what if? And then when it was real, like, yes, I knew it.
See,
and that's a great feeling.
That is so carefully done.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's also you want that and not the, and maybe this is part of the difference is the reader.
I can see it
want
coming
that
a mile away, right? Is a problem.
Yeah. It's the difference between how close is it?
Yeah.
You don't want to see it a mile away, but you want to have that sneaking suspicion that it might be this. And then, because if it's too close, it's like, oh, we turned over there. I didn't see that coming at all, and I don't believe it. When that's
yeah. Well, I mean, so one of the things that's involved here is foregrounding and backgrounding information, right? So if you want to provide ingredients for a revelation that you want your reader to have subconscious but not conscious clues about, it's very helpful to use backgrounding techniques with the information, such as putting the information in a subordinate clause of a sentence, or putting the important piece of information in the midst of an array of other items that all appear that like they might potentially be important, but likely none of them are particularly important, if that makes sense, right?
Seeding. Yeah.
Seeding. Well, yeah, but you want to seed it like carefully. And I think part of it, so one of my main techniques in this arena is point of view. Because the more information you have to manage, the harder it's going to be, unless you can find a way to cut down what people have to pay attention to. And my personal solution for this is extremely tight point of view, so that you only have to understand as much as one person can understand at any given time.
Right.
But also multiple points of view.
But also multiple points of view to give the reader more perspective and allow them to have just a little more insight than the characters do. Yeah.
And that's an interesting balance to try to give when the readers wind up understanding more about the world than the individual characters do. That's hard to do without overrunning the character, but then they see ahead enough to see what the characters can't quite see, but then it
Mhm.
all makes sense when it actually beats out because they've seen it from these other three angles. What's coming.
Yeah.
That's the difference between, you know, with the other character points of view, you can say, okay, I know this not because it's really obvious and you can see it a mile away. I know this because this character knows this character doesn't, and you're sitting there like, oh,
Right. And it
yeah,
creates
no, sit tight, he'll deal with it. Just don't. No, you're gonna.
See, there's an enormous amount of potential in dramatic irony, right? where you know something, but the character doesn't know something, and you're like, no, right?
And if you've done right, it's more fun than don't go through that door. Somebody's gonna shoot you, and they go through the door and bad TV.
Yeah.
But
yeah. So, like, one of the things that I try to do is I try to help my readers understand my characters well enough that even when they're in scenes with each other, you still kind of have a sense of what the other person is thinking.
Building up those little quirks, those little bits about the character, like in your novel. I know you've overly plugging Mazes of Power out now from Juliet Wade, but
Read Mazes of Power. There we go.
read Mazes of Power, but you get a sense of what they're all about, so that when they're actually put into the thing with each other, you can understand what they're doing.
Yeah. So you have a pretty good guess about how the other person is feeling, even when you're not in their head, because you've been there before. And hopefully you know them well enough to be able to say, uh-oh, he's not going to be happy about that or whatever.
yeah.
The other piece is how would I refer to this? I guess I would call it kind of the subjectivity of the point of view when they have certain kinds of emotional states. Like, there are certain kinds of emotional states that cause you to sort of spiral down and become very myopic and not notice things, right? Like your physicality and the sensations in your body sort of overwhelm your ability to perceive small details in the world around you,
or even large. I mean, to speak from personal experience, when I get down and depressed, the world literally seems grayer to me and more constricted. I'm not noticing anything. I almost like it's almost a vignetted world in my. So I don't know. I don't know if that's synesthesia, tying in with my depression or what. But yeah, I just don't see edges of the world. It's like it's just not paid attention to.
I think that's very real for a lot of people. And so I like to try to do things with subjectivity that, everybody experiences it to some degree, because, like, for example, if you're running through a room because you're being chased by a monster, you're not going to notice what the curtains are made of, right? You're going to be like, crap, there's a monster chasing me. Where's the exit, right? So that is an information management question, in fact, because the character's not going to notice a lot of that stuff. And so, for example, if you want somebody to understand why this person gets stuck in the room with the monster and can't find the exit or whatever, it's valuable to have visited the room in a previous situation when the parameters of the room could be noticed by someone, not necessarily the protagonist who's later running from the monster. But particularly if the parameters of the room are important to the outcome, it's valuable to have visited the place before.
Yeah, it's like turning the camera lens on it so that when the climactic thing happens, you can visually put the dots together. It's like, okay, this is okay. There's the giant curtain here, that's what he's going to use, even though he doesn't notice it yet. We know it because we've seen it there. It's almost kind of like, I know the overused Chekhov's gun, but you got this giant wall hanging that you've seen in the
Right.
previous scene, even though the character isn't seeing it at the moment, you know it's going to tie up because it's still there.
Right. And you know, so I'll give you kind of a sneak peek example. So I have a character in book 2 who is unlike other characters in book 2 because she's just used to having a more detailed perception of her surroundings. She's a very active person and has to sometimes get away from situations in creative ways. That is actually a feature of her character. And so I set it up pretty early so that later when she's in a pinch and goes, hey, wait, there's a ladder on the wall, nobody's like, how did she even notice that in this situation? Right? Or you know, there's a roof that I could climb onto here. If I make that suddenly out of the blue, oh, gee, there's a roof that I could climb onto here. It's less effective than if we've been there before. We know there's a roof there from the previous scene where we visited this exact same spot. But it never occurred to anybody that one might climb onto it at that point, right?
Mhm.
And then later it's like, put the character together with the roof and you go, oh yeah, of course she's going to climb up there because why not? Right?
Yeah.
So that's what I mean about it's a distribution of information, right?
Mhm.
But I don't want to spend the time. Like, you have to decide what you want to spend your time and words on at any given point.
Words are ammunition. You have to use them carefully.
And they are
This-
also time.
Yeah, their
It's
time
like
and their
The
attention.
reader's perception of time is linked to the number of words. And
I
it's
can-
not direct, but the more words you have, the more time they perceive passing.
I can tell that you started off as a short story writer because you're thinking very much like a short story writer in the parsimonious nature of handling words, as opposed to a super epic anti-fantasist who might use walls of words. You're very much more particular about using words efficiently. I appreciate that. This is a feature, not a bug. But then you get the 1,000-page doorstopper where you can go 5 pages just describing the meal and nothing really changed, versus a short story writer going into novels and everything counts. It's a layer of density that you've taken from your short stories and taken it into novels and used that. And I'd almost like to say, I shouldn't prescribe, but I think that novels could stand to learn to write short stories to get this information management thing down. So they don't waste 5 pages on something that could have taken 2.
Well, I mean, so there is actually a lot of value in a long description of something if that's the point, right? And it
Yeah.
depends on what genre you're writing, as you mentioned, whether it's you know, epic fantasy or for example, there is a huge value in voluptuousness of prose in, say, romance novels, right? And so, you know, highly efficient use of words is fine, but there is an effect that is created by the voluptuous use of language, which
Well,
may be the effect you want.
That's fair. I'm
But
talking. Go ahead, Mary.
here's another thing that you can, if efficient use of language doesn't preclude long descriptions.
Right.
It just means that the length of the description is, every word that you include in it means something.
Mm-hmm.
Is
It
a
has a
necessary
function.
part of the description.
Yep.
Sometimes descriptions have to be longer than that, you know,
Mhm.
longer than, yeah, it was big. Okay, it was big.
Oh,
I mean, look at, this is, I don't know if this is a good example, but look at I know it's an example that comes to my mind because it's words, but elephants are large versus elephants are ponderous. It's the same number of words,
Mm-hmm.
but one gives you more information than the other.
Right.
But it also doesn't tell you, neither word tells you everything there is to know about elephants. So you use the number of words that you need to convey the amount of information that you want the reader to have about elephants.
Right. And also the feeling that you want them to have.
Yes. Yes. I mean, large doesn't give you a feeling. Ponderous gives you a feeling.
I'll tell you why. Large is a word that is used so often that it becomes divorced from any singular usage context. So whenever we hear a word, basically our brain brings up every context in which we've ever heard the word ever that we can recall at the same time. And then we match it to the current context. So a word that has been used in so many different contexts, actually it sort of dulls the strength of any single context in the midst of these myriad contexts. Whereas something like ponderous has fewer contexts in which it's used, and so it brings up those contexts more forcefully. That makes sense?
Yes.
Yes.
Hopefully. That was one of the coolest things I learned in psycholinguistics.
I mean, it even goes with colors. Like, even though the two words for the almost exact same color, red is much more pedestrian than, say, crimson.
Right.
Or ruby.
Right.
It's also much less specific.
The ruby liquid in the goblet is much more vivid than the red liquid in the goblet.
Right.
Red is very non-specific. Red is a colored group rather than a color.
Well, and very often, so since we're on this topic, and this is information management, one of the things that you encounter in science fiction and fantasy a lot is very careful word choice, because if you use a word that has too few contexts, it will anchor you too strongly to those contexts, which are earthly, mundane contexts. If you use a word that is more commonly used, right, then it will be less tied to those specific contexts. So we tend to pick the words that we use in science fiction and fantasy so that they are not specific to a particular earthly context, but will evoke certain types of contexts that we have on Earth that then are being analogized. So things like using indulgence to talk about the way that an Embati servant perceives the kindness of a nobleman in Varan. I pick indulgence because it comes from a context here where it has specifically to do with rank distinctions and servants and that kind of stuff. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so yeah, so information management can happen on a lot of levels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's in narration.
Yes.
And
Which
you could, okay.
Which we should probably stick to, because dialogue will give you information about characters, and I guess it will also give you information about the world, obviously. But
well, dialogue goes, yeah, and also there's plenty of narration that gives you character information or otherwise, depending on how you're handling points of view. Depending on who your narrator is. Right. But yeah, like dialect features tend to be more prevalent in dialogue than they do in internalization, even, or in just narration.
Well, it's not even just dialect. It's the knowledge that a character has. If you have someone, if you have in a story, call it a story that's set in one of our subcultures here, and like
Okay.
the one that some of the common elements that we grew up with. And a woman says, can you hand me the jacket, please? And her boyfriend looks in the closet and says, you want the teal one or the chartreuse one?
Mm-hmm.
That tells you something that about the man, about the boyfriend. It's like,
Yeah.
he knows what teal means and he knows what chartreuse means.
And he cares
And
about the distinction.
he cares about the distinction, or he knows that she cares.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, conversely, if he did hand me that jacket and he just pulls out one, then that says a lot about what he thinks. Like, no, he's going to make the choices, or he knows she doesn't care or whatnot. And that's revealing either way.
Yep.
Yeah.
Another one that is very, very revealing is the use of metaphor and simile. Any kind of comparison that you do in your, that you let your character do either in internalization or in dialogue, is going to tell you a ton about not just the thing being described, but also what's normal to that character. And also a lot about the culture that the character lives in.
Yeah.
And they're also their opinion of said object. Nicantor always uses mean comparisons.
Yeah.
He's never comparing anything to anything pretty.
And that says a lot about the character. That, I mean, Nicantor is a broken bird in many ways, so it doesn't surprise me. Yeah, that you might be talking about what he's doing in book 2. That's just like in book 1. That that's the way he thinks. That's his worldview's oriented that way, and you're conveying information management about him in the way he uses his metaphors.
Yes.
Or doesn't.
Yes. Because usually, okay, so metaphors usually have a thing being described and then a sort of zone of comparison, right? And so usually what you're doing is you're saying that the thing being described is less familiar and the things in the zone of comparison are more familiar. Here is a thing that I expect you to know about in order to use this to illuminate some aspect of this thing that is currently being looked at.
And that also can be used to add more elements to your world building at the same time. If both sides of it are unfamiliar, that tells you what characters are thinking about. Oh, this is as hard as a three-legged Andorian. Like, what the heck is a three-legged Andorian? Well, they must be hard because
right.
You've just thrown something else in.
Believe in the sky.
Or
believe in the sky, exactly.
With the familiarity and unfamiliarity thing, so it would be something like it would be like a Varney looking out across a field of grass and going, wow, it billows like bed sheets. Right? Whereas a person on Earth would probably be more like, I don't know. We tend to use nature as the zone of comparison rather than as the thing that's being questioned and compared to more mundane things.
Yeah.
It has to do with what we're familiar with.
I mean, we didn't evolve in cities. We evolved out of nature. So even the most urban person, looks to natural metaphors.
Yeah. Well, and it's partly just the habit, right? We have tons and tons of verbal habits that we just pick up from other people because they use the same verbal habits.
The baby babbled like a brook. Now, I mean, has the person actually ever been to a brook to hear it babble? Maybe even not, but it's still there.
Right. So like when I'm in Varan world, I have to work really hard to make sure that everything that anybody compares anything to is actually available for them to compare to.
Mhm.
Now they have their deity system, and so that's very helpful to me because I can use that on a lot of different levels. But a lot of times what I'll end up having to do is I'll have to come into a scene going, okay, what is the array of background information that I need to have available to me in order for this character to be able to get through this scene and judge everything correctly, etc. So I keep getting phone calls. I don't know why. It's okay though. So yeah. Don't compare it to something that you've never seen or heard of before.
Yeah.
If you live underwater, don't compare it to a desert unless you've been to a desert. So,
And, you know, well, you have to be aware of we mentioned this earlier, common perceptions about something.
mhm.
I mean, there are certain scents that remind me of some of the more pleasant experiences of my childhood.
Mhm.
But I'm pretty sure that gasoline and rotting fish do not have the same sense of nostalgia for most people.
Depends. It depends.
They're probably people who spend time on boats and in marinas.
Yeah.
That would be
Yeah.
and had a
you know
good
what?
time.
If you have something like that in the story, it opens up an entire world of that person's experience, right?
Mhm.
If you mention something like that.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that people sometimes don't realize is how single words just can open up so many different realms of meaning for readers. Like even just single words are just incredibly powerful. And so sometimes you want to go for them and sometimes you want to avoid them like the plague, you know. There's a reason why the leader of Varan is not a king.
Mhm.
You know, because that has so many implications that I really can't afford to have people bringing to the story. You know, it doesn't work like that. But the
Yeah.
easiest way to say it doesn't work like that is just not to call it a king.
I mean,
Yeah.
those kind of words have power even within our own society. I mean, consider the late Roman Republic where Julius Caesar was desperate not to be called a king, even if he was an autocrat in all but name, because that word had really negative connotations to the Roman people. It's like, and it's like that comes into fiction as well. I mean, that king brings a lot of baggage.
Yeah,
So
tons.
people would assume a lot of things about the Baron that are not true,
right?
and kind of throw them out of the story in some ways.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to mention is cultural narratives. So we have stories that we tell about stuff and how things work, right? And particularly when you're looking at political stuff, right? We have stories about who we are and how we label ourselves politically and what that means. And other people have very different stories that they tell about the exact same words, right? And what those words mean. And so I kind of say, well, you know, Varney should have that too, right? If you're in a world, then is it the kind of world where people wouldn't have a narrative about who they were and what that stood for, right? And so that's another type of information that can kind of sneak in depending on how you handle it. If you let people talk about who they are, you'll learn something about the cultural and political narratives that people use in this world. And that can be very useful.
Yeah.
Right. And I tend to be very, I tend to have people engage with the question of what other people are for, which is always very fraught, because people definitely have opinions about what other people are for, but they don't usually talk about them explicitly.
Yeah.
So I'll have, my soldier character will talk about what medics are for, and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an interesting way to, that's a, I shouldn't say inhuman, because it is unfortunately very human. That is a very particular way to look at people as tools, as roles, as pegs to be put in the board.
Yeah.
And that if that's common in society, you're saying something about the society of people. I mean, the casts in the barn kind of play right into that. You're kind of saying that people, you kind of have your board set up, and that's how people look at things in the barn.
Yeah. So, okay. So then the other thing that I want to mention is that question of inhalation and exhalation, which is what I personally call it.
Okay.
Is that, but it has to do with rising action and falling action, and like what happens in the story. There's inhalation is when the story is picking up lots and lots of pieces and information. Exhalation is when it's kind of narrowing down and you stop picking up new pieces of information. And I think my impression is that this has to do with a sensation of momentum in the story. That when things start to narrow down and you stop getting lots of new pieces of information, it tends to make things get sort of faster and accelerate towards the climax, in sense.
Right, and that it's kind of natural shape of a lot of stories, rising action, and then we start narrowing things down, be it in a single book or in a book series. And when that pattern kind of gets bobbled, it feels wrong. I will not name the series, but I just finished a series where the third book was adding more and more stuff. It's like, no, this is the time to narrow things down. This is not, it felt really wrong. It's like you're not narrowing the possibilities here. You're expanding them. That's felt a little unsatisfactory for the conclusion as a result, because there was just like,
well, it is interesting.
Information management
definitely changes the impression. I think I was looking, so I believe it was Henry Lien is giving a talk soon about different types of narratives and moving away from sort of Western style narratives, and like how conflict is used, and how, and I think information management is a part of that. Right? So we come in with an expectation that a story is going to have a particular type of structure, right? And it could feel wrong if it goes off of our expectations. But it doesn't mean that's the only way to tell the story either. So anyway, so yeah, go look up that thing by Henry Lien, because that should be really cool. Talking about how different cultures manage narratives. But yeah, I think my sense is that what you have is you have to start in a place that doesn't have a ton of information, because you have to hook people in a spot that they can understand. And then the further you go, the more time you have to teach them the different things that they need to know. And so it just kind of expands for a while. And that's in my parlance, it's called the inhalation section of the story. And then it starts to kind of narrow down again. And at a certain point, I think it has to do with that time measurement. Words equals time too, right? The sense of high pace. If you're adding a lot of extra stuff, is not going to be as intense as if you don't have a lot of extra stuff, right?
Yeah.
This is partly me musing. I'm not, I haven't written an academic paper on this, but it's something that I feel very strongly about, which is why I thought it would be fun to talk about.
Another use of information management can be in avoiding, say, the white room syndrome. You can use information management to avoid just the talking heads sitting in the white room and parceling out the information into, say, a conversation so that you build up a world that way rather than just it being able to allow characters and people to visualize what they're actually doing.
Right.
It's the double triple duty. Like, okay, you're grounding the characters and you're showing the world and your information management. The light of the slightly red sun slanted over Eris as he looked at his friend. You've just thrown an extra. Now we have extra bits of information rather than just sitting there in a white room about the world, about the characters, where they're sitting. You can do lots with that.
Yeah. The other thing that you just made me think of is, so I had to do something kind of challenging where I had and if you've read Mazes of Power, basically the accession ball, it has this very specific ceremony that has to take place, and it has words that have to be said, and they have to be said in a particular order. But if you were just to go through that ceremony word for word, it wouldn't be that interesting. Like, I mean, okay, it'd be interesting to a point, but then you'd be like, okay, I'm putting a lot of attention on the ceremony and maybe losing track of what's going on with characters, right? And so what I did to make sure that I didn't have to spend all my time on the ceremony was have other things going on between the characters that pulled their attention away from what was happening in the ceremony, right? So that you have a miniature crisis going on in the midst of the ceremony. And okay, let's get this crisis resolved. Oh, wait, we've jumped forward in the ceremony by, 5 minutes. And now we're on this different section of it. And we're almost done or whatever.
The ticking clock again.
And the major participants in the ceremony have no idea that the ceiling was leaking 2 minutes ago.
Right?
For example.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was it's a thing that happened in my wedding. Apparently the ceiling was leaking.
Oh dear.
We didn't find out till later. I mean, during the reception, but people do things behind the scenes or at the edges, and
yeah. And it's funny because the amount of focus that you place on a particular piece has a lot to do with how that section is perceived, right? If the scenario that's going on, like if the words of the ceremony are not that important, then you don't have to pay attention to them. You can pay attention to the other thing. But if you're in the other scene where there's a ceremony and the words of the ceremony are very important, which point in the ceremony are we going to get attacked, right? Then you have to pay attention, not necessarily to what's being said, but what the people are doing and when the next critical juncture is going to occur.
And the nature of the side episode and how people respond to it can say something about the importance of the ceremony.
Right.
Because, the idea of the whole ceiling thing, certainly the leaking ceiling was not more important than our wedding.
Mm-hmm.
And people were working to make sure that it did not become the focus.
Right.
As opposed to people sort of wandering out and I don't know.
And saying, but
other...
I love her too.
Well, I was thinking more on the order of, wandering out of the room and finding something more interesting that mattered more to them than, the wedding that they agreed to come
or
to
you
it.
know, or if somebody has a health crisis
Nobody did
in
that.
the middle of the ceremony, right? And then they have to get rushed out for some reason.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, the like a novel story set on your wedding could like use point of view to have people running around dealing with the leaks and only occasionally show the beats of the wedding, or do you have the wedding and that's kind of faded and blurred out for a while? You can
Yeah.
jump around and show what's important, which can vary moment by moment within the story. And this goes back to your thing about point of view to actually tell, because I mean a story is only a slice of life, because you can't have the panopticon of existence, so you have to pick the moment by moments you actually want the reader
Yeah.
actually have.
Mhm.
And
In fact,
that's
yeah.
the power of a writer, make those choices.
But also you get to choose how much of the scene that they were in the character remembers clearly after.
Yes. Yep. Memory is important
Ceremonies
too.
are really important, and at the moment you may have a very sharp understanding of what's going on, and later on you'll just sort of go, I don't remember a thing.
Yeah. It
I
became a
remember it was
blur.
wonderful, but do not ask me details now, because I
Right?
got
Or you
this
can
10
have
minutes
two
ago and I
people
don't
who
know.
are two people who can be in the same situation and remember it completely differently,
That too.
even if they remember all the events the same.
Mhm.
Right? They either interpret them differently, or maybe they remember different pieces of it as being important.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, information too, is, who remembers which details and who doesn't remember any details at all. And
Or their memories get wrapped up with fantasy and perceptions, and they invent details, excise details, and so the narrative of what happened is different in their mind than a objective reality. Which, what is an objective reality anyway? Because
Well, I
even if
mean, I think
well,
in fact
objective
that
reality is person A said these words. No, no description of inflection, no description of facial expression or tone or gestures. Just person A said these words, person B said these other words, person C walked from left to right across the platform.
well,
But
okay,
then you
so
get into, platform versus dais.
I think that you're saying something really interesting here. And I'm going to bring up the question of speech acts. Okay? Because speech acts are a linguistic sort of concept, but basically a wedding involves speech acts that you get married by speaking, right?
Mhm.
You go from not being married to being married, but you don't have to walk across the stage. You have to say the right words in the presence of the correct people, right? And
Right.
that makes it happen. So, in fact, depending on which acts are being carried out, the requirements for the objective reality might be different, right? Was that an invitation, or was it a refusal, or was it do you know what I'm saying? It depends on which participants are present and what is said by what people, and whether the context is correct. Does that make sense? Because like if you pretend to get married in the presence of somebody who's not authorized to marry you, then you didn't get
Right.
married.
but you might think you are. This reminds me of
Yeah.
a movie called Laws of Attraction with Julianne Moore and Pierce Brosnan, and they wind up in Ireland. They're opposing lawyers, and they think they got married. They actually didn't, but the ceremony and everything else looked to all intents and purposes that they got married, and they for a while they act as if they are married because they think they are.
That is actually a common trope.
Yeah, it's a romantic
in
comedy, so yeah,
stories, but
it plays a trope hard.
yeah, it's usually the other way around. Is the the explorers come to a culture and the locals offer them dinner and one of them offers a particular one a special thing, and because they're not locals, they don't understand they've just gotten married. And
Yep, the movie
sort of a
Stargate.
ridiculous idea.
Yeah, where the main character's wife gets married by accident and didn't realize it's like, oh wait, what? What did I do?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
so I think in when it comes to things like objective reality, there are more things available to be perceived in any given context than we can actively notice, right?
Mhm.
And I think that applies to storytelling as well. There are more things that could objectively be perceived in this fictional scenario than we could possibly hope to describe, especially if we want to have some sense of storytelling momentum, right? And so in fact, everything that you put on the page is a question of information management, right? Which is why, so which is why I keep bringing up things from pragmatics, which is one of my favorite aspects of linguistics. So go out, study pragmatics because it's awesome. But yeah. So everything that you do is a choice.
Yeah.
And making choices instinctively is great. I'm all for it. Right?
Yeah.
But personally, I prefer to have conscious control over my decisions as much as I can. I mean, I can't do it all, right? I can't control everything consciously. It's just not a thing that humans can do.
This is why you review your drafts.
This is why editing is a thing.
Yeah.
This is why editing is a thing.
You write your story and you go and you look and you say, okay, I made that choice instinctively, but for this particular situation, that instinct is wrong.
Sure.
It doesn't fit. I need to go back and change this.
Mm-hmm. A lot of the stuff that we perceive unconsciously is repetition patterns. And so I'm mentioning that. I mentioned subordinate clauses earlier, and I'm mentioning repetition patterns now because a lot of this stuff gets talked about in writing courses, at least in high schools, but never on any level where you can kind of tie it down to what the words are on the page.
Mm-hmm.
So like, how do you hide information in a sentence? Put it in a subordinate clause is actually like a technique that I use. Yeah, okay. You can make your sentence get all cattywampus and seem really weird if you overdo it.
Yeah.
But using conflict to allow people to say the thing that is, as you know, Bob, is actually really useful because people say things that other people already know all the time when they're in conflict. So conflict is a great way to get information into a story. You know?
Yeah.
You know the nuclear reactor puts out 10 neutrons per second. You know this.
Right?
So
why isn't it doing it right now?
Yeah.
Playing with that expectations versus reality thing for your characters and all that kind of stuff.
And but thinking out loud, because sometimes people will do that. They'll look at a situation, and if your character happens to not be talking to somebody else, but they're facing a problem, they can stop. They can say, all right, if they're a very methodical character, you can stop and say, okay, this is a situation. I have no idea what's going on. Let's back up and take a look and say, it's supposed to be doing this.
Mm-hmm.
It's doing this other thing. Let me go step by step and figure out
where it diverged.
What's different, what changed.
Mm-hmm.
And that works for some characters, and some characters will just sort of go, it's not doing the thing. I gotta call somebody else because it's not doing the thing, and I got no idea why.
Yeah.
But then you
know what?
Mm-hmm.
You guys know about the rule of 3, right?
Yes. I've told you once, I've told you twice, so I tell you 3 times it's true.
Okay, well, so things tend to happen 3 times in stories.
Mhm.
The first time you see it, but you don't necessarily notice it. The second time you go, oh, I've seen that before. That might be a pattern. And then you look for the confirmation at the third point, which is why it tends to diverge. And that's the structure of jokes, for example, is it tends to diverge from expectations in some way on point 3. But that rule of 3, which gets talked about in across contexts in writing, is actually comes down to repetition patterns, right? So repetition patterns are super, super important because they can happen on basically any level. You can repeat sounds. You can repeat words. You can repeat phrases. You can repeat
Points of view.
whole scenarios.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's actually really powerful.
Right. There's a Michael Moorcock, Jerry Cornelius novel where you eventually figure out that he's repeating 3 different points of view in 3 different points of time, and you can follow the once you got that down, then you can follow the pattern in the rest of the book and anticipate what's going on because you've seen the pattern and seeing he's doing the thing.
But you know, our subconsciouses are actually really good at tracking repetition.
Humans are pattern creatures, sometimes not seeing patterns that aren't even there, but yes, we're very good at pattern recognition. That
Oh,
we've
absolutely.
evolved that way.
And it just depends on where you're gathering your data points from.
Yeah, spot the moving thing in the Sahel is important to primitive humans. So we evolved
Absolutely.
for it.
Where do you think that rabbit is going to jump next so that I can hit it with my spear and not die?
and get dinner, yes, so I can survive.
Exactly.
Spotting disruptions of pattern is important. You know, even if the pattern is not an active pattern, if you have, you know, a situation, something keeps blinking on the side of my screen. I have no idea what it is, but it catches my attention. Every time my brain says something just changed.
Yeah.
And you know, okay, that's ADD.
Well, no, but that's why phones ring. It's a call response pattern.
Right.
They don't just go off like an alarm that goes that keeps going off until you smack it. Right? Because they want you to answer, so they're going to behave as though they're going to give you an opportunity to answer.
Yeah.
And that's why if the phone rings 4 times, I start climbing walls. No, make it stop.
It's been about 4 times and 3 times, and you know, that's it's not.
Well, I mean, and also theme. Theme is something that repeats a lot of times, right? Not just 3, but like bunches of times.
The 3 is a magic number, but it's not the only number.
No, it's not the only number. But like the higher numbers is when you start to get into these patterns that feel like flow, right? But in the end, it all comes down to what are the words that are on the page, right? And what do they evoke in the reader's mind, which, you know, to some degree you have no control over. So.
Yeah, because you have to make assumptions about what culture the reader has, what they grew up with, what their experience with a given word is. You know,
and I think that's one of the reasons why we find new kinds of narratives challenging, right? But I mean, it's all I think expanding our contexts is an imperative. So yeah. Well, it's 5 o'clock, you guys.
We did the thing.
We did the thing. You know what? You guys rose to the challenge. I was really happy with this discussion. So thank you so much for taking it on, even though it is kind of an esoteric sounding topic. But
Dive into World Building contains a variety of experiences.
that's right. Sometimes we get super technical and sometimes we don't.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I will stop our live stream. Thank you for everybody who was watching and everybody who will watch in the future. And hopefully we'll see you next week.